Hello, fungi friends. This is the second episode of the Fascinated by Fungi podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking about my process for how I identify mushrooms. This is going to be sort of an overview with a little bit of storytelling and then looking at some of the resources I use and kind of going through my process that I think about when I find a mushroom and I don't know what it is. I don't have a formal background in mushrooms or mycology. I've never taken a class. I have some books, but, read them sort of minimally when I feel like it. And I guess my point of saying this is that I'm by all means considered an expert in fungi, and yet I feel like I know very little. And that's because there's a lot to know. I think I know more than just a little bit, but the topic and the field is so vast that the more you learn about it, the less like you feel like you actually understand and know, because you just realize how much more there is to learn. And that could be a scary thing. I think it's part of why a lot of people feel very intimidated, potentially even scared of mushrooms. It can be the root of a lot of the mycophobia that we see in society, is the fact that people don't understand mushrooms unless they fear what they don't understand. And I can totally relate, because there's sort of this gigantic monolithic subject that seems completely overwhelming. And you're like, where the hell do I start? How do I look at a mushroom and figure out what it is? Because there's so many different kinds, there's so many different colors, textures, flavors of mushrooms that, like, how could you possibly come to understand what something is by just looking at it? I can tell you over time, once you learn some basic features and you kind of get this process down, it's not that hard to kind of bin out your mushrooms, but it is somewhat confusing to start the process. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk to you guys a little about today. I'm thinking back to 2016. I was snowed in Northern California, and I was going stir crazy. And the only thing I could really do was go for a walk in sort of Doug fir forest. And there wasn't a lot going on. There wasn't a lot of green stuff to look at. There wasn't any flowers. It was snow on the ground, but there were a few mushrooms. And the one that I found that really jumped out at me was this beautiful red and white mushroom. I know now it was not Amanita muscaria, which is the classic red and white mushroom. No, this was a smaller, had a much brighter red top and white gills and a little white stem on it. I didn't have enough context to understand what I was looking at. So I was like, okay, how do I figure out what this is? And I didn't have access to any mushroom books, which the easier thing would have been to do to just flip through a mushroom book and potentially keep looking until I found a picture that looked kind of like what I was looking at. Instead, I just started Googling, red and white mushroom, which took me down completely the wrong path, because if you type that in, you find Amanita muscaria, because that's the most famous red and white mushroom. And it took a lot of Googling. And actually what did it was talking more than just the color of the mushroom, was talking about the texture of the mushroom, because I noticed the mushroom was pretty brittle. I could kind of break it. I could mess with the scales. And my point in saying this is that sometimes describing a mushroom, the visual description of a mushroom, isn't very useful, because a lot of mushrooms, from a visual description of a visual standpoint, sound pretty similar. However, if you describe other features, like maybe the way they feel, the textures they have, the way they smell, the way they break apart, the habitat they're growing in, all this kind of stuff can give you some contextual clues as how to identify a mushroom. So I typed in, red and white mushroom. It was kind of brittle. And that brought me to Rusta, which is a genus of ectomycorrhizal mushrooms. Common name for them is called brittle gills, because they have these spheroid cells that, when you mess around with them, break very easily. So I was able to figure out that what I had was this red Rusta. It was probably a Medica type Rusta, which is one that's commonly known as the sickener. And guess what happens if you eat that? It can send you to the hospital. And what was kind of interesting, what I know now, is that although that is a toxic mushroom, there are places in the world where they eat that mushroom and enjoy it. That is because they process it differently. And I think that's sort of a good mindset to think about, is that some things that we think of as toxic could actually be edible, given the right preparation. We do this with vegetables all the time. There's certain things we wouldn't eat unless we cook them a certain way. And I think if we think of mushrooms in a similar way, there's a certain way to say that, like something is definitively toxic, like amanitas, these guys up here that can kill you. And there's no amount of processing that can make a deadly amanita safe. Not going to happen. But there are edible mushrooms that, if you don't treat them right, can make you quite sick. So something like shiitake or morels, if you don't cook them enough, can make you very ill. So again, that's just kind of reframing the toxic, non-toxic discussion and thoughts about mushrooms. But I found this red Russula. It inspired me to want to learn more about mushrooms. And then a couple months later, I was in New Zealand having a grand old time, and I saw this beautiful fuzzy brown mushroom on a tree. And what I didn't realize at the time is the partial veil, the part of the mushroom that kind of covers the gills as the mushroom is maturing, hadn't opened up yet. And so that took away some of my contextual clues for what a mushroom looked like, because I didn't know what the gills looked like. I was just like, what is this fuzzy brown mushroom growing on a tree here in New Zealand? I had no idea. And Googling it wasn't helping, because writing the description of fuzzy little brown mushroom on a tree in New Zealand wasn't really getting me anywhere. So I put a picture on social media. I put it on my Instagram. And this is pre-Fascinated by Fungi. This is on my personal Instagram. And I had a friend who I hadn't seen since college message me. And she's like, I didn't know what it was, but I sent it to my friend who lives in New Zealand, and he's a forager. And he said it is this Agroscope parasitica, or Cyclocybe parasitica is another name for it. But it is, I forget, there's also an indigenous Maori name for it, and that completely escapes me right now. But this mushroom is very similar to a piapini, sort of a little velvety cap mushroom. It's still a delicious edible. They grow all over New Zealand natively. They're also invasive, infecting some of the trees that have been planted there for landscaping and stuff like that. So when I settled down in New Zealand, I started going for hikes in the local botanic garden, and I found a lot of this Agroscope parasitica. And I had enough experience with it from having seen it before to feel fairly confident in my ID. I found a website called Hidden Forest NZ, and that was a sort of a New Zealand specific mushroom page and guide. And so I'd compared it with the things on there. I'd compared it to some stuff online. And I just kind of slowly started learning about this mushroom. And after I found it like 3 or 4 times, I was like, okay, I feel confident enough to pick one of these, take it home and cook it. My partner at the time refused to eat it because she was like, that could be a toxic mushroom. There's no way. And I was like, all right, well, what if I eat it and I'm okay? And they were like, okay, I'll consider it. So I cooked it well. I tried a small piece. It was really tasty. I waited a couple hours, didn't feel any discomfort, so I had a little bit more. And then I waited about 24 hours to see if I was going to feel anything weird. I didn't. I felt great. And so the next day I was like, okay, I'm going to make dinner with this. And my partner was a little trepidatious at the time, but took a big bite and enjoyed it. And that was sort of the start of me foraging mushrooms and picking mushrooms to eat, which has inspired a whole lot more mushroom hunting and other good things in my life. So my point in saying some of this stuff is that you don't necessarily need to go buy a book. You can find a lot of resources online. You can rely on community and people around you to help verify the things that you find. And in fact, that's always a very good idea, to not just rely on a single source, but have a website, have a book, have a friend, have a forum, have places that you can post your pictures and share the things you're finding. And what's really important in that is that you take a picture, because mushrooms are very visual. And as I was mentioning, it's extremely hard to figure out what something is from just a description. And every day I get people sending me a version of what they think is a good description of a mushroom. And I look at it and go, I have no idea, because without a picture, I have no context for what I'm looking at or what you're seeing. And, in this case, it is very much true that a picture is worth 1,000 words. It's generally not that useful to describe a mushroom. Occasionally I can get it, especially if it's sort of a unique sounding one. Like someone was just telling me, they're like, I have this weird sort of cage-like red fungus. And I was like, oh, 100%, that's Clathrus ruber. It's the red cage basket fungus. But that's a weird one. And that description actually fits. Most other things, if they're like, well, it's huge and it has a stem, and you're like, it's not helpful. I can't really learn anything from that. So I guess it's just a process of helping to kind of change people's minds about how they think about a mushroom. And so I'm going to give you guys some of the tips that I have for taking photos that will help you identify what you're looking at. if you send me or other mushroom experts a photo, it's a good idea to listen to these tips and tricks, because frequently if you just have, a bunch of mushrooms in your lawn and you take a picture from above and all you can see is like the top part of the cap on the lawn, we have no idea what that mushroom is. And we're going to ask you a set of questions related to like, hey, did you do this? Can we see that? And if you haven't done those things, then really there's no way that we can ID those mushrooms for you. So the things you got to do, take a good picture of a mushroom, are put yourself in the place of a mushroom, think about your perspective, and importantly, what you really need to do is get a picture of the cap and the cap color, but also bring your phone down to the level of the dirt, of the ground. Get a picture of the mushroom in the ground from sort of the side so that you can see the stipe, so you can see the gills, and the stipe is the stem, just interchangeable words. See the gills or the pore surface, what's called the hymenium, where the spores are coming out of. Pay attention to small features, like is there striations on the edge of the cap? Are there, is the stipe fibrous? Are there little hairs on it? Are the gills attached? Are they free? Or do they run down the stipe? Are there pores? Did it stain any color if you handled it? So those are all sort of visual things you can really key into. And if you look at my Instagram, you'll see in a lot of photos, I use a little macro lens to get even closer to some of these features, as I think they're aesthetically pleasing, but they're also very useful when you're looking at distinctions between different mushrooms and trying to figure out identification, to look at some of these small features. And they're not necessarily microscopic features. They're just things that you might not generally notice if you're sort of looking at a mushroom from afar. When you get really up close to it, you start to see these details. And with mushrooms, the devil is always in the details, because there's a lot of things that can look very similar, certainly from like a immediate visual perspective. And if you have an untrained, unpracticed eye, a lot more things look similar because you haven't realized those small nuanced differences. The more that you look at mushrooms, the more you kind of create these visual fingerprints for how mushrooms kind of bin and fall into different categories. I think there's different approaches to learning stuff like this. If you pull out a classic book like the ID Guide, All the Mushrooms Promise and More, that'll have one of these things called a Dichotus Key, which tries to help you sort of sort out which category a mushroom belongs in, and then use some basic features like the attachment of the gills, the spore color, the shape of the cap, some of these other things. But I find those are really confusing, because more often than not, a mushroom going from young to being old can completely change its shape, change its color. Some of the dichotomous key things are kind of confusing because there's a lot of weird names like umbonate, which means like belly button depressed, decurrent, which means gills that run down the side, adnate, detached. There's all these sort of fairly scientific-y terms that come from old school biology and people describing mushrooms. And I don't find them super useful to learn all those terms before I learn a mushroom. I think now that I've learned a bunch of mushrooms, it's useful to learn those terms so I can describe some of those sort of nuanced features of a mushroom. But I think initially that kind of stuff is really confusing and often kind of overwhelming. So it's not super helpful to have one of those dichotomous keys, because most human beings function better on sort of a very visual input rather than this sort of like weird checkmark logic type flow of figuring something out. And some people's brains work like that, but mine does not. I am very much, I want to look at a picture and just show me 1,000 pictures instead of showing me 1,000 words. Because I get a lot more out of a picture and I get a lot more out of a mushroom by examining its visual features than I do by trying to sort of write down the physical features of it into language. I just want to look at them. And so that's what I recommend you guys do too. So yeah, when taking a photo, other good things to pay attention to is the light, right? You want to be potentially in full sunlight, or if full sunlight is too harsh for your phone, get into some shade, maybe take a photo inside light and in shade so you have both contexts. If you do have low light, you can always pull out a cell phone and like get a little extra light on it, because sometimes seeing the true color of something will help you identify it at a later date. Think about angles, right? I like to get a photo of the mushroom in the ground from the perspective of it like right beside on the ground. So I'll put my phone all the way down. If you have an iPhone, you can always flip it around even so the lens is closer to the ground, and take that sort of picture looking up at the gills, and it'll help you see if there's a partial veil. It'll help you see the texture of the stem, all this kind of stuff. When you're picking the mushroom up, and I do recommend you do this. You can touch most mushrooms safely, so don't worry about picking one up and looking at it. Give it a sniff. See if it has anything that's a non-standard earthy aroma, because a lot of mushrooms actually do have an interesting aroma, and it's a thing that people forget to do, is to just smell what's in your hand. Feel the texture of the mushroom. Is it slimy? Is it dry? Is it goopy? Is it rough? Is it smooth? Break it apart a little bit in your hands. Is it brittle? Is it fleshy? Is it hollow, pithy, all this kind of stuff. You want to think about, when you do take photos of it, you can hold the mushroom in your hand. And, for aesthetic purposes, I often like to kind of hold it up in my hand with a path in the background, so you get this nice perspective that happens when you take a photo. And just really pay attention to the quality and kind of photo you're taking, because that will help a lot when you go to try to ID them. And my favorite thing to do with photos is to upload them to an app / website called iNaturalist. The link to iNaturalist is on the FAQ page of my website. So if you hear this podcast and you can't remember iNaturalist.org, you can go to the FAQ page of my bio and look up iNat there. I also have recommendations for some other books and other websites that I particularly like and use as part of my identification process. So definitely check out my website. iNaturalist is kind of like what I call like a real life Pokedex. You can take a photo of literally any living thing, upload it to the app, and its visual algorithm will do its best to identify what's in front of you. And for the most part, it does a pretty good job. For most flowers, insects, amphibians, birds, etc., it's usually spot on. It doesn't always get the species right, but it'll usually put you into the right genus, or at least order of a plant, animal, fungi, etc. And it, like I said, it works with really any form of life. It doesn't have to just be fungi. It doesn't have to just be slime molds. And what it does is it then uploads that photo to sort of a Google Maps type interface. And so if you want, you can have that photo be public. You can also obscure a location. Say you happen to find a really dope chanterelle spot. You want to share that you found chanterelles, but you don't want people to know exactly where it is. You can obscure your location. It'll keep it in the general area, but it won't be related to where you actually found it. Or you can just completely make it private and have it only be you that sees it. The cool thing about iNaturalist, though, is that the photos and some of the metadata get uploaded to this sort of publicly accessible bank of information that scientists have access to, because iNaturalist is hosted and coded by the California Academy of Sciences. So it's a publicly funded app. It will never charge you money. It's not like one of those plant ID or mushroom ID apps that will charge you like $5 a month as a subscription. Those things are a sham. Their algorithms aren't as good, and they don't help community science. So again, I always say I think iNaturalist is the best app and platform out there for doing any form of identification, whether it be fungi or anything else. Clearly, I'm biased, but I do like a free service that caters to scientists and is supported by public funding, rather than an app that makes private company money, because I find that, kind of disingenuous. I don't think nature should be profited off of. I think that nature is something that exists in the world and something we should all be thankful for. And the fact that some people try to monetize it, I find frustrating. I don't think the education of it is, I don't think that's unfair to charge people for classes, but I do think it is sort of unfair to present a company as being sort of caring about nature and then somehow also profiting off of nature. So I try to do everything I do generally in my educational sense for free. And that's partially because I've learned all about this mushroom stuff on my own, autodidactic teaching myself on the internet and from books. And so I don't want to put my content or my knowledge behind a paywall. I want it to very much just be a function of the fact that I'm learning along with you guys and sharing my process, just like I'm doing here on this podcast. Another thing to do as you find a mushroom is take good photos of it. But just to start sort of visually binning mushrooms, as I've sort of mentioned, there's a few things you can do. And this goes back to that kind of dichotomous key. And I'm not going to think about a dichotomous key, but I am going to think about general categories of fungi that you can start to understand. And this is something I got to go on a hike with some, my parents have these family friends who have a 4-year-old daughter this summer. And I went out with her, and within about 5 minutes on the trail, we'd run into pretty much all of the major archetypes of mushrooms that you find. And she, as a 4-year-old, keyed right into this and was like running back to me and being like, does this fit this? Does this fit that? And I was like, yeah, she's got it. She's 4 years old. Granted, she was like a little forest nymph child, so she was kind of in the woods already. Didn't take her long to key into this stuff. But as like a 4-year-old can understand this in 5 minutes, then I think adults can understand this too. So the kinds of general categories of mushrooms that you're looking at from a visual perspective are going to be your standard gilled mushroom. So that's generally a mushroom that has a stem and a cap, and underneath the cap, there'll be gills. Gills are a very effective way to disperse spores. So they've been evolved many times across many different lineages. Doesn't mean that every gilled mushroom is related. It simply means that they all came to the same conclusion about the best way to spread their spores. That's why they have gills. There are also bolete mushrooms, which are similar in that they have a stem and a cap, but instead of having a bunch of little gills underneath, they have a series of tubes that hang down beneath the cap, and they look like a bunch of little holes underneath the cap. They're called pores. But in truth, those pores are really just tubes kind of hanging down from the cap. So whether you have a gilled mushroom or bolete, those will generally both be like fairly fleshy. Not always. Gilled mushrooms can be small and wiry and all sorts of things, but boletes are often like pretty fleshy. And then you can have teeth fungi. So there's not that many teeth fungi. There's stuff like hedgehog mushrooms, which are edible and have little teeth. And there's some other unrelated mushrooms that also have teeth. So there's like hydnellums, which have little teeth. There's lion's mane and northern tooth fungi, which are polypores that have teeth. So none of these mushrooms are related, but they've all evolved small teeth as another method to disperse their spores, because again, it gives them a lot of surface area, just like gills have been evolved multiple times. So you've got gilled mushrooms, bolete pored mushrooms, you've got teeth fungi. We also have stuff like polypores, which are generally wood decay mushrooms that are growing straight on wood. And they'll have a whole bunch of little pores or holes on the underside of a mushroom. It's often like a shelf or a conch or something like that. And they're usually often pretty woody, or they can be kind of fleshy and edible like a chicken of the woods or a beefsteak fungi. But they have a lot of little pores underneath. And that's another thing to look for. So you have these things called polypores. And again, some of the stuff is like you're binning based on what the pore surface or the gills look like. But think too about, where you're finding this mushroom, the habitat you're in, other contextual clues, and that'll help you kind of figure out what things are. So beyond the polypores and the gilled pored teeth mushrooms, you also have what are called gasteroid mushrooms. So those are mushrooms where the spores develop internally. A classic example of something like that is a puffball. It's a little white ball that's on the ground. And as it matures, it goes from being all white inside to being kind of yellow to being fully brown. And a little hole opens up, and as raindrops hit the puffball, spores come shooting out. There are other gasteroid fungi where the spores develop internally. You have things like bird's nest fungi, which are super common in wood chip beds. And those are little splash cups with tiny little eggs that are covered in spores. So the raindrops fall in and splash the eggs out, spread onto the surrounding substrate. You have stinkhorns, which are these really totally unreal looking things, where the gasteroid part of it is this sticky black gleba stuff, which is really stinky and attracts flies to help spread the spores. So that's not reliant on wind to spread spores. Instead, it's attracting animals. There are mushrooms called Hypogeous or Trufflelike fungi. So those are mushrooms that have evolved to basically live underground at all times. The adaptation is to low moisture conditions, because if you're a mushroom above ground and you have low moisture, you're going to dry out and not get to mature and spread your spores. So in certain places where drought conditions are more common, especially here in California, we have a lot of these hypogeous truffle-like fungi that live underground. Problem is, though, if you live underground, how do you spread your spores? Because your spores are ever really only going to be localized to where your fruiting body is. So the solution of a lot of those hypogeous fungi is similar to stinkhorns, is to use animals to help disperse their spores. So a lot of these truffle-like fungi develop very, very strong odors and smells. So animals will come dig them up, eat them, chew on them, mess with them, and help spread the spores around. And so I think that's a thing too that a lot of people forget, is that many mushrooms are actively soliciting you to come mess around with them. So maybe they help explain some of the textures and colors and amazing things that we see fungi and why we feel so attracted to them on this base level, because they've literally been keying into our evolution for millions of years, being like, hey, come mess around with me, come eat me, come do something to help me spread my spores, because they're recruiting us as animals to help them, which I think is kind of fun. Because again, if we think about putting ourselves into the perspective of fungus, of a mushroom, it's not something you normally think about from a human perspective, but it makes sense if you are a mushroom and you're just trying to get some help to do your thing, So beyond the gasteroid, there's claviloid mushrooms, which are sort of corals and clubs, and really they look like very underwater. Those are super cool. There's crust fungi, so there's things that just kind of grow all over wood. They don't really form into shelves the way polypores would, but they'll just be crusty all over stuff. You have also a whole class of mushrooms called ascomycetes. There's two main divisions of mushrooms. You have basidiomycetes, which is majority of like the gill, the pore, the polypore, the things we recognize as mushrooms are generally basidiomycetes. Ascomycetes are a little bit more of the weird stuff. Sometimes they're called sac fungi, but those are morels, cordyceps, black truffles. There's a bunch of weird cup fungi and things that sort of go into this ascomycete zone. And those generally look a little bit more alien to us than a lot of the other mushrooms. And so I think it's kind of cool to start, like, again, binning out. It's like, is this a basidiomycete? Is it an ascomycete? Does it have pores? Does it have gills? What does it look like? Start trying to understand some of those like basic big divisions in mushrooms. And very quickly, you can lay down some of the basics that'll help you start looking in the right direction. And using a tool like iNaturalist helps you as well, because you're able to take any photo you have from any point in your life and upload it to iNat and at least get a direction as to what you might be looking at. So I think that's all really cool. Another thing to keep an eye out while you're looking for mushrooms, you will inevitably see slime mold, which are often living in this plasmodial phase. So there'll be this kind of like goopy yellow, white, whatever stuff crawling over surfaces. And as they mature, they will form into these beautiful little sporangia fruiting bodies, which often look like little insect eggs and things like that. And as those then mature from this sort of shiny white, orangey, whatever color into like brown things and their spores start coming out, that's when you can really start figuring out what they are, because as the plasmodial stage, it's very difficult to identify slime molds down to a species level. You can sometimes figure out the genus. But again, having something around to take photos with allows you to catalog and understand this stuff. Another tip and trick that I really like is for, I do majority of my photography on my phone. And I find the phone to be very useful for being out in the woods, because I can focus quickly. I can adjust light levels quickly. I don't have to worry too much about messing around with the camera settings. It's just kind of a tap and shoot kind of thing. So I take a high volume of photos, take them quickly, see a lot of stuff, catalog a lot of things, occasionally get a really exceptional photo. And one of my main hacks is to get a clip-on macro lens. So you can buy clip-on macro lenses online. You can get one for like 15 to 20, 30 bucks. They're not super expensive. Do not buy a super expensive one, because they're not any better than the cheap ones. There are smaller ones and bigger ones. It's like a 10x versus a 15x, and it gives you a slightly wider field of focus with a bigger lens. So I like that, but you can get a little bit closer with a smaller lens. Those are great for slime molds, because you can get up a lot closer than you would otherwise with your phone and see more of the features. And that helps you catalog some of the sort of small nuanced features I was talking about, like hairs on the stipe, or, the attachment of gills underneath the cap. All that kind of stuff is really good. So some other tools you can use, if you pick a mushroom, you bring it home. The best recommendation I have to learn about mushrooms, because people are always asking me, is how do you identify what's edible, what's toxic? And I was like, well, you don't. You have to learn mushrooms one at a time. I think of it a little bit like playing a role-playing game, where when you first start out, you're like a level 1 wizard, and maybe the only spell you can cast is fireball. So what do you do? Well, you go out into the wilderness and you start killing zombies and rats with your fireball, and all you can do is spam fireball over and over and over again. And it's kind of like going out foraging and be like, well, I only really know how to recognize like chanterelles, so I'm just going to just hunt chanterelles. But when you go out and you're looking for chanterelles, well, gosh darn it, you're going to see other stuff. And while you're comfortable casting fireball, you don't really know what anything is, so you might not know. But the more times you go out, the more stuff you see, you're going to start keying into things, and you're going to start leveling up. You're going to learn other skills. So suddenly you just learn lightning bolt and whirlwind. And now you can forage for black trumpets. You can forage for hedgehogs. You can find some of these other mushrooms that you feel confident and robust enough about identifying to potentially bring them home. And this doesn't have to be in the realm of edible mushrooms. You can just pick up a mushroom, take it home, really do a study on it, and try to figure out what it is. Like I did with that red Rusta, I brought that back and I was just intensely looking at this thing, trying to figure it out. And I didn't have any intention of eating it. And especially that was good because I found out it was poisonous. So that's another thing. You should never assume mushrooms are edible. You should always assume something is inedible until you find out otherwise. And even then, you shouldn't rush to eat something that may or may not be edible. You want to be very robustly sure that it's edible. Always cook it well, always try a small piece, wait a while, follow that process I was talking about. Some of the things you can do when you're trying to ID mushrooms and thinking about, what is this? And you're trying to generate that sort of visual fingerprint for yourself, as well as some other pieces of information that are going to be helpful if you do look at a book or you take this to a website. you want to know the spore color. And often you can figure out the spore color by just looking at the mushroom in context and seeing the spores around where the mushroom has been. But if you want, you can take that mushroom home and do something called a spore print. This really only works with, it's not going to work as well with like a gasteroid fungus if the spores are inside. It tends to work best with like a mushroom that has a cap or a polypore where there's a clear sort of pore surface. And so you'll take that cap or polypore and put it on, I like aluminum foil best actually, because all spore colors will show up on aluminum foil, and aluminum foil is sort of inherently like, fairly clean and easy to work with. You can use white paper or black paper. Sometimes people will take white and black paper side by side and put a cap on top of that so they can see if it's white or brown, black spores, etc. Often what you'll do is you put down a cap and you want to put it in an area where there's not a lot of airflow so you don't have disruption of people walking by. So you can put a bowl over it. But sometimes if you do that, the humidity gets high and the mushroom rots out. So you do want to do this with a mushroom that's in pretty good shape and probably keep it under relatively low humidity. Otherwise, you may end up with a moldy mess in 24 hours instead of a nice spore print. That has happened to me. And again, I like aluminum foil because if that does happen, aluminum foil, you just fold it up and toss it out instead of paper where it might have soaked through to the table or something like that. So just, small tips. But spore color is actually usually not that helpful because you can pretty quickly tell what spore color is by just looking at the mushroom. There's usually some part of the spore deposit. So spore prints are more of like an aesthetic thing than it really is part of your ID process because they're not that useful for the ID process because they take a while and all they really do is give you spore color, which can help you bin mushrooms, but it doesn't give you as much information as you might want. I get a lot more from just looking visually at that mushroom than I do from like the spore color alone. Other things you can do, so there's some field tests. You get a potassium hydroxide, which is like a basic solution, and you can drop that on mushrooms, and some mushrooms will undergo a characteristic color change that can help you differentiate species or just genre based on what a color change is. If there's no color change or it turns purple or orange or whatever happens to it, you can use a solution of iron salts, look at reaction there. That's a fairly advanced one. It's not as useful. KOH, I think, is the best sort of thing to carry around in a dropper and put on mushrooms. Plus, there's some pretty cool reactions you can do with it. You can pay attention to, like I said, the smell of the mushroom, the feel of the mushroom. Does it stain a color if you mess with it? If you, score it and latex comes out, does that latex turn any color? If you do see latex, it's probably lactarius. Those are milk caps. So there's some sort of like small things you can do as you mess around with mushrooms. The more you learn, the easier it becomes to bin these mushrooms. And the other thing I would say is like, look at tons of photos. If you do have access to books, look at the books. Make sure they're newer books with lots of color photos rather than older books with out-of-date names and illustrations or photos that are not as relevant. The internet is a really good place to look at lots of photos. So iNaturalist is a place you can go and look at what's in your habitat, look at what's growing in your area, just look at a bunch of photos. You go on social media. Instagram is an incredible mycology community, and you can just make a mushroom only account and just do nothing but scroll through pictures of mushrooms all day and learn visual fingerprints and context from seeing exposure to a lot of stuff like that. There's some more sort of sciencey things you can do. Really, a lot of mushroom ID comes down to like, well, you really should do the microscopy because what you need is take the spores, mount them on a slide, put a little bit of water on, put a slide cover on, and then you can look at those spores under a microscope. And depending on the size, whether they're ellipsoid or they're round or they have little doodads on them, you can start to figure out, what kind of mushroom is this based on the spore, or if you're trying to differentiate between two closely related mushrooms, sometimes looking at the spores is really the only way you can tell. But not everyone has access to a microscope. Not everyone knows how to mount a slide. So that's sort of more of an advanced thing. Speaking of advanced stuff, people are doing a lot of sequencing right now. And so this is DNA work where they're crushing up a small piece of mushroom, extracting some of the DNA. They're adding some primers, and they're doing this sort of DNA barcoding / fingerprinting, where they're making small segments based on conserved regions within the mushroom genome. And they're looking at the size of the fragments that come out of the PCR and comparing that to sort of known fragments. And then with that, they're able to put them into context on a taxonomic tree and talk about their relatedness based on the conservation of genes across fungi families. And so this is useful, and it's doing a lot of reorganization of our mushroom taxonomy and sort of revolutionizing our understanding of how mushrooms are related. Because traditionally in science, people were just going on things looking similar, having similar features being related. Like I said, there's like multiple kinds of tooth fungi. So they're like, well, all tooth fungi are related. And as they found out, they're like, actually, most tooth fungi aren't related. They all just evolved teeth separately because it was an effective way to disperse their spores. So there's sort of a revolution going on right now in taxonomy based on this DNA barcoding, on the sequencing that's happening But that sequencing is very limited because it's really based on 4 or 5 primers. And so it's like trying to categorize every single human being in the world by just like 4 fingerprints, which leaves out a lot of nuance. There's a whole lot of the rest of us that they're not learning about. Like maybe you can categorize people by 4 fingerprints, but you're missing out a lot on the other information that's present, the other life history, the other interesting things that might be part of that mushroom. And so there's also a whole bunch of whole genome sequencing. And there's this great project happening at the Joint Genome Institute called the 1,000 Fungal Genome Project, where they have Department of Energy money, and they are sequencing 1,000 different fungal genomes. And so this isn't just mushrooms, this is also molds and yeasts and things like that. But they're, instead of just getting 4 fingerprints, they're taking the entire genomes. They're taking the whole body and doing a full sequence on it. And they're learning everything they can about the genes that are present in those fungi and those mushrooms. And they're able to mine some really interesting information on the enzymes, on the biosynthetic pathways, the secondary metabolites, the things that are in these fungi. And so we're learning a lot about that. And that has real implications for biotechnology, for bioremediation, for just understanding the ecology of these fungi and how they fit into an ecological, context as a whole. So I think that stuff's really cool. And we're going to see a lot more of that in the future. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's pretty much it. I will come back next week with another episode. In the meantime, if you guys would like to learn more from me, please check out my fascinatedbyfungi.com website. I've got an FAQ page on there where I answer a lot of questions. I have links to iNaturalist that I mentioned, some of the books I actually really like, a bunch of other resources and common answers to questions. I have mushroom discounts on mushroom kits and supplements and snacks and stuff like that. I have a bunch of cool merch. So I have original t-shirts, designs, leggings, tumblers, all sorts of stuff. So please check out my website. Definitely follow me on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, Twitch, all these things. Hope that everyone has a wonderful week. Get fascinated by fungi, get out there, find something. Even if it's in the middle of winter, you might find something if you go for a walk in the woods. Take a picture, put it on. If you're really excited about something, feel free to send me a picture. I'll do my best to help you. Sending you guys much love, and I'll talk to you next week. Have a good one. Bye-bye.